inclusion and diversity here at Auburn University. And on behalf of Auburn University, I want to welcome everyone and really express my excitement about this being the first of our spring semester events in the Critical Conversation Speaker Series. I see some familiar faces out there in the crowd. So many of you have joined us for some of our other series during the fall. And in the past 6 months, we've welcomed some of the nation's foremost thought leaders on topics that are critically vital to our campus dialogue. Today's speaker is no exception. We're honored to welcome Mr. Robert Shibley to Auburn's campus to share his thoughts and insights on the importance of free speech in higher education. We know that institutions continue to debate the limits of free speech amid a backdrop of hate speech that has inevitably clashed with calls for increased inclusion, diversity, and safety on our campuses. What we're hoping is that tonight's event will ignite in you the desire to take full advantage of the free speech that's afforded to you by the First Amendment, as we know these principles are really important. I'm thrilled, as I said, to see you all here, and I look forward to seeing how Mr. Shibley's time with us has an impact on our campus. So the introduction tonight is reserved for two of our stellar students here at Auburn. We have Bree Thomas, our outgoing SGA Executive Vice President for Outreach and a major in political science. And we have Chip Brownlee. Chip, the editor-in-chief of the Auburn Plainsman and a double major in journalism and political science.
Good evening. It is our honor to introduce our guest for this evening, Mr. Robert Shibley. A native of Toledo, Ohio, Mr. Shibley serves as the Executive Director of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, otherwise known as FIRE. He holds an undergraduate and law degree from Duke University and is the author of Twisting Title IX.
During his time at Duke, Mr. Shibley served as the managing editor of their campus newspaper. In this role, he led a team of student journalists who frequently criticized. And because of that criticism, they often faced censorship and bias. This experience was pivotal in leading Mr. Shibley to a career dedicated to fighting for the preservation of free speech in academia.
Since establishing FIRE in 2003, Mr. Shibley has become a leading voice for all things related to the First Amendment. Along with traveling to various campuses, he has represented his organization through influential media outlets, including The O'Reilly Factor, CNN Tonight, and Fox and Friends. He has also contributed to the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Time. He and his family live in the Research Triangle area of North Carolina.
And as you listen to his keynote tonight, we hope that many of you will have follow-up thoughts, ideas, and questions. We encourage you to take what Mr. Shibley has shared and learn from that and learn with one another. So this evening, we are providing an exciting opportunity to continue this conversation. Following his talk, you're welcome to join us for complimentary coffee and hot chocolate in the atrium. It is our hope that you stick around, have a refreshment, and a conversation with a friend, new or old, so that we can continue this important dialogue with the Auburn family.
Let's give Mr. Shibley a warm welcome to Auburn University.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome. It was really more than I think I probably deserved. I want to say that my time at Auburn so far has been great. The folks here have done such a great job welcoming me, and it's really good to see all of you out here in the audience today. I want to thank Auburn. I want to thank Vice President Clayton and the Auburn University Critical Conversation Speaker Series for inviting me to speak with you today. Given that I'm here to talk about the critical role that free speech plays on college campuses, not just today, but as a matter of principle, I'm glad that I'm here at the invitation of a speaker series that has the word critical right in the title. The topics that have been addressed so far in this series, such as ideological diversity on campus, the questions of bias, triggers, and microaggressions, and how they may impact our lives, issues about how we treat women in leadership roles, and how to have civil discourse in what seems to be an increasingly polarized country are all indeed critical conversations. They're happening off campus, so it's important that they be able to happen on campus as well. I'm also particularly pleased to be at Auburn today because, as it happens, Auburn University is the most recent university to receive a green light for its policies dealing with free speech and fire. So please give yourselves a round of applause. I really appreciate that. Let me explain a little bit how important and special that is. Every year, fire reviews the speech codes of more than 400, it's up to about 460, of the largest and most prestigious universities in America using a red light, yellow light, and green light system. And by speech codes, when I say that, we're talking about all of the university regulations, no matter where they might be found, that put students at risk for speaking their mind on campus. Our red light rating is given to universities that have speech codes, or at least one speech code, that is clearly and indisputably unconstitutional, and to private universities which violate their own promises of free speech. An example of this would be Pierce College out in Los Angeles, California, where you can only pass out literature. In this case, this is student Kevin Shaw. He was going to pass out Spanish language translations of the Constitution inside a tiny free speech zone. You can see, if you look at the slide, if you see the colored bricks there, you can sort of see below that, I didn't realize that was a touchscreen, that it says free speech area. So you can see in the taller picture, he's standing with 1 foot inside and 1 foot outside the free speech area. That's the only place that you are allowed to pass out pamphlets at Los Angeles Pierce College. You can see it's not really because of a space constraint. And FIRE is suing Pierce College as part of our Million Voices litigation project. And Kevin Shaw is our plaintiff. So far we've been victorious at the first level, and we'll see. Hopefully, Pierce College will decide that they don't want to continue this fight, and they will revoke this rule. Sometimes these kind of severe restrictions can also be chalked up not to this sort of obvious desire to limit speech, but to carelessness, if only because it's hard to think of any other reason for them. Prior to FIRE's objections, in which we were joined by the ACLU of Louisiana, Grambling State University prohibited sending emails containing, quote, any disruptive or offensive messages, including offensive comments about race, gender, hair color, pornography, religious beliefs, and political beliefs. And I'm not exaggerating. It means that along with what most people would consider to be bad online behavior, both criticizing pornography and making fun of someone's hair color was off limits at Grambling State. These sorts of overbroad red light regulations might seem silly at times, but they aren't. They can have real consequences for the students who get caught up in them. At the University of Oregon, oops, that was a good one though. At the University of Oregon a couple of years back, man, a female student jokingly shouted, "I hit it first," out her dorm room window at a couple engaged in a public display of affection. While she was joking, and she didn't actually know either person in the couple, let alone engage in any kind of making out with them, the couple did not see it that way. They did not think it was funny. They used windows, counted windows to locate her dorm room, stormed up, demanded an apology from her, and then they took the matter to student affairs. The unfortunate jokester was then hit with no less than 5 student conduct charges. Remember, this is for 4 words. Including sexual harassment and disorderly conduct. Thankfully, she came to FIRE, and through publicity, we were able to get Oregon to drop the charges. Without that, this lady would have gone through her life marked as a sexual harasser because of her single 4-word joke. When you consider the impact that such a finding will have or would have had on her employment and her educational prospects, the injustice of the situation becomes very clear indeed. So those were some red light codes. Yellow light codes, yellow light schools have codes that are written in a way that's not necessarily unconstitutional every time they're applied, but which can too easily be abused in an unconstitutional fashion. One example of such a school, and I am just picking at random here, would be the University of Alabama, which dictates that all posters, Signs and bumper stickers should be in good taste. And good taste, of course, is no kind of objective standard, and it means different things to different people. And there's this. That was my favorite one. What passes for good taste in Tuscaloosa may not pass for good taste in Auburn, and vice versa. And regardless, while something that is in bad taste may also be unprotected speech, such as harassment, threats, or libel, the fact that such speech is in bad taste doesn't enter into consideration from a legal perspective. Threatening to kill someone in an extremely tasteful way does not get you any points with the court of law. And finally, there are green light schools like Auburn that have no policies that either violate the Constitution or that could reasonably be used to violate it. For instance, while Auburn has set forth an open-air forum where both students and non-students can engage in free speech without getting any kind of prior permission from the university, Auburn also guarantees free speech on the rest of its campus, saying, "Nothing in this section shall be interpreted as limiting the right of a student's free expression elsewhere on campus, so long as the expressive activities or related conduct do not violate any other applicable university policies, such as those about amplified sound or loud and disruptive noises in the middle of the night." And Auburn, I should note, is the only green light school in the state of Alabama. Now, how is the rest of the country doing? The good news is that this year's survey saw the number of schools which received a red light rating decrease for the 10th year in a row. 10 years ago, of the 346 schools we rated then, 75% had red light policies, 21% had yellow light policies, and only 2% had green light policies. Contrast that with the 461 schools we rated for 2018, which you see here. This year, 32% had red light policies, and only 26% of public schools. That's still too high, though it's obviously a big improvement. Most of the schools that are no longer red lights are now yellow light schools, and they comprise 59% of the total. And 8%, 38 schools, now that Auburn has joined the group, have green light policies. And while 38 schools across the United States is not very many, in 2008 that number was 8 schools, only 2% of all the schools we rated. Progress is being made. You may wonder if the First Amendment, which safeguards the freedoms of speech, religion, the press, assembly, and petition, actually applies on campuses. Legally, there is no question. It most certainly does. After all, it wouldn't make any sense for your peers who chose to skip college or didn't have the chance to go to college to have more rights than you just because you decided to pay the government extra to get more education. 18-year-olds can vote, they can run for office, they can die in the service of their country. It would make no sense to tell them that they can't fully participate in the political process just because they happen to be on a college campus. Unfortunately, our nation's commitment to free speech is tested in just about every generation by one force or another. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, obscenity was often the impetus for censorship. Indecent books, like Lady Chatterley's Lover, were banned from being sold in some cities or from being sent through the mail. Later, during the era of World Wars I and II, anti-war or unpatriotic speech was often targeted. The case from which the famous saying that the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man from falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic dated from the World War I era. The 1950s, of course, had the Red Scare and McCarthyism, driven by the looming specter, which seemed very real at the time, of atomic destruction at the hands of the Soviet Union. The 1980s and 90s introduced the now famous idea of political correctness and ushered in the modern era of speech regulations on college campuses. And today, safety rationales for stifling certain kinds of speech are in vogue, with proponents of these restrictions comparing whatever they define as hate speech, a term that does not actually have a definition in American law, to actual physical violence. When we look back at these with a historical perspective, it's frequently difficult to avoid feeling surprised and even a little smug at how mild the expression that caused all the fuss seems to be from our perspective today. While Lady Chatterley's Lover does indeed contain at least one explicit sex scene, it's written using verbiage like, at the back of his loins, the fire suddenly darted stronger. It's basically all in that. It does get a bit more graphic than that, but that gives you the idea. But at the time, this sort of scene in a novel or any kind of mass entertainment was really unprecedented. It was an era of mass social movements generally, the turn of the century, including those for women's suffrage and for the prohibition of alcoholic beverages, both of which would soon become law. Carrie Nation, for example, became famous for leading groups of women into bars and destroying them with a hatchet, for which she was arrested 32 times. It shouldn't surprise any of us that a society where that kind of behavior regarding alcohol would gain wide support would also look askance at what to many of them will be the most graphic depiction of sex that they could possibly imagine. 20 or so years later, it was patriotism's turn to serve as the excuse to censor. World War I had just ended, although at the time it was called the Great War. It was called the Great War because the nations of the world were reeling after years of violence on a scale that had never been seen before. Both the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary, the largest country in Europe, had completely vanished from the earth. This situation was the backdrop for the 1919 case of Schenck versus United States, in which a Philadelphia socialist, Charles Schenck, was convicted of violating the Espionage Act by passing out pamphlets urging people not to cooperate with a wartime draft. Famous Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, probably the most famous one we have, wrote at that time for a unanimous court, all 9 justices, that Schenck's expression was indeed criminal, saying, "The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent." And if you ever, the words clear and present danger, that's the passage where they come from, if you ever hear them in any context. Oliver Wendell Holmes is generally the person who started that. And what did this pamphlet, this clear and present danger to the survival of our republic, actually say? Get ready. It opened, "Long live the Constitution of the United States." It went on to argue, civilly and not unreasonably, that the draft is a form of involuntary servitude, which it is to the state, which it is that it's banned by the 13th Amendment, which it's not, and that people should resist it. Schenck wrote that the Constitution of the United States is one of the greatest bulwarks of political liberty, and argued that in the Revolutionary War, the people of the United States established the principle that the freedom of the individual and personal liberty are the most sacred things in life. Now, 99 years later, whatever you may think of the Constitution or of the legality or moral rightness of the draft, most of us would consider it nothing short of insane to argue that this sort of speech could land someone in jail. But in 1919, it earned Charles Schenck time in prison. And just a year later, in Abrams versus United States, the Supreme Court approved a 20-year jail sentence, 2 of them, for 2 other unfortunate left-wing pamphleteers, though this time, Oliver Wendell Holmes seemed to be reconsidering his decision, and he was joined by Justice Louis Brandeis, who is a hero to many of those of us who are free speech buffs, in dissent. But a great deal of damage was done. It was not until 1969, in the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, that the Supreme Court finally killed off Holmes's clear and present danger test for good. The menacing specter of socialism and communism was used to justify the attacks on free speech that happened in the 1950s, the Red Scare. And it was indeed a scary time. The Soviet Union had gotten the bomb, thanks to spies who stole the plans from the United States. And Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who you may have seen depicted falsely in this case, waving a shoe, was an emotional type. He was prone to saying things at party meetings like, "We will bury you." Colleges across the country were questioning professors about their political views, their ties to the Communist Party, and their loyalty to America. Many colleges even required professors to sign actual loyalty oaths as a condition of their employment. The University of California system's loyalty oath, which is partially still in force now, forced professors to sign, as a condition of receiving a salary, a statement that, among other things, affirmed that they were, quote, "not a member of the Communist Party or any other organization which advocates the overthrow of the government by force or violence." Legally, this Red Scare came to a head from academic purposes in the 1957 Supreme Court case of Sweezy versus New Hampshire, in which the state's attorney general was trying to force Professor Paul Sweezy, who was thought to be a Marxist, to answer questions before the state legislature about what he had said in a campus lecture. Sweezy refused, and thankfully, the Supreme Court took his side. Chief Justice Earl Warren famously wrote the following words that have become a touchstone for courts and for those of us who care about free speech on campus. The essentiality of freedom in the community of American universities is almost self-evident. No one should underestimate the vital role in a democracy that is played by those who guide and train our youth. To impose any straitjacket upon the intellectual leaders in our colleges and universities would imperil the future of our nation. He goes on, it's not on the slide, but he goes on, teachers and students must always remain free to inquire, to study, and to evaluate, to gain new maturity and understanding. Otherwise, our civilization will stagnate and die. Now, I came to talk about the importance of free speech on campus today, so you may wonder why I have spent this much time talking about the history of free speech controversies and not all of them on campus. The reason is, when it comes to arguments for censorship, there's really nothing new under the sun. Sex, politics, religion. The issues that most move us and about which we hold our most passionate opinions are also the ones where we most desperately seek to silence those who disagree with us. Sure, we say we would not ordinarily censor or punish or even jail someone for saying something we disagree with normally, but this time it's too important to be so liberal about it. And yet our track record with what we decide to censor is nothing short of miserable. The example of the Roman Catholic Church's punishment of Galileo for his insistence that the earth revolves around the sun and not vice versa is so commonly used, it seems trite even to bring it up, but it's so commonly used precisely because it's such a great example of the grievous mistakes power can make when dealing with views that challenge it. I could probably take up the rest of my speech discussing examples of times when the authorities insisted a certain belief constituted the truth, and that those who disagreed should be silenced, only to be proven utterly wrong. That's the story of most of recorded history. Only when the philosophical movement that we now call the Enlightenment arrived in the 17th and 18th century did a different way of conducting society's affairs start to be seriously considered by a large number of people. Many things emerged out of the movement that was the Enlightenment. Not least of these was the United States of America and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that gave our country its unique character of not being based on kinship or tribe, but on shared ideals. But the Enlightenment also made possible the system of scholarship and discovery that serves as the basis for Auburn and for practically every other college in our nation. This system doesn't have an agreed-upon name, like democracy for government or capitalism for economics, but author and Jonathan Rauch calls it liberal science, and that's as good a name as any. In his 1993 book, The Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, Rauch develops and explains the concept of liberal science as the idea that the, quote, checking of each by each through public criticism is the only legitimate way to decide who is right. In other words, it's the idea that if we actually want to advance in our knowledge of the world and of each other, we have to be free to make statements or hypotheses and then defend them from our critics. If the critics can successfully prove them wrong, then the idea dies away. If the critics can't prove them wrong, then the idea may be right or may at least warrant further consideration. The problem is that this system, as productive as it is also very demanding. Disagreement over, for instance, the boiling point of water might not lead to much in the way of bad feeling, but disagreement over the age of the earth, over the validity of evolution, or the nature of climate change, even these scientific topics are fraught with angry argument, let alone arguments about the nature of God, the right economic system to have, or the existence of racial or gender prejudice in society, and then what to do about it. As Rauch writes, diversity of belief, thought, opinion, experience is a fact, like it or not. Harness it, and you have the engine that generates knowledge. But diversity of belief is also a dangerous social problem because it makes conflict inevitable. How do you stop people from breaking up into little tribes, each with its own opinion, or from fighting each other to decide who is right? In a world abuzz with conflicting opinion, most people will not necessarily know or believe the truth. In fact, most of the time, people will be wrong. some of them dangerously so. What if they come to power? How do you ensure that truth prevails? And what do you do to the people who are not inclined to believe it? How do you bring countless millions of subjective realities to some kind of convergence? And if you can't, who do you believe? These are hard questions, and the process of considering them is unpleasant. It seems to be a pretty universal rule of human nature that people find it painful to be wrong. I know I do. It's embarrassing and can have social and professional consequences. If I have some facts wrong in this speech, I'm sure someone out there will point it out to me in the Q&A, and I'll be hugely embarrassed, and depending how bad it is, maybe in trouble with my boss. The more wrong you are, and the more publicly you are proved wrong, the worse you feel. And yet, our system of liberal science, of knowledge gathering, depends on this very thing happening on a daily basis, and as publicly as possible, so that bad ideas can be replaced by better ones as quickly as possible. Well, this process takes place all around us at work, in legislatures, in courts, even in our own homes. Ground zero for this work is none other than university campuses. Universities are concentrated areas for liberal science to do its work. And not just in the science and engineering labs, but in dorm rooms, in common rooms, and on quads, and even on athletic fields. While not every student is a scientist, every student is running an experiment on themselves. College students are figuring out what they believe, what kind of person they want to be, what they want to do with their lives, and so much more. And if my college experience is any indication, they are making mountains of mistakes while they're doing it. Some of those mistakes cause me immediate pain. Some only make me cringe when I look back at them in retrospect. And all this was before everybody's walking around without a tiny high-definition television camera in their hand. So how do we live in a society that makes these high demands of us? I know that some people would answer this question with some variety of toughen up, snowflake, the world is a mean place. But Rauch offers a more helpful answer, which is that we must all take seriously the idea that any and all of us might at any time be wrong. And if you take one thing away from this speech, please let that be it. I said this answer is helpful, but it's not easy. It's enormously demanding. It means being willing to question our deepest convictions and our most intense feelings, and consider the possibility that the person you despise most might be right. Too often we're told even to consider such a thing is to somehow betray our principles, our community, or even our humanity. But one of the key things that Enlightenment figures grasped better than anyone had before is that engaging with the ideas you disagree with most and the people you disagree with most, even the people you hate, benefits you and our society, even if you are hating every minute of it. The philosopher John Stuart Mill, in his famous treatise on liberty, wrote, "The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion, still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error." If you want to be sure you're right, you need to be able to listen to the people who are sure you are wrong. Even if they're ignorant and you don't learn anything, they might learn something which helps them and society, and you will have the greater assurance of the correctness of your beliefs. As Thomas Jefferson put it when he was writing about his founding of the University of Virginia, this institution will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. For here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error so long as reason is left free to combat it. Or as Senator Bernie Sanders put it more recently in regard to student demands that conservative pundit Ann Coulter not be allowed to speak at Berkeley, "What are you afraid of, our ideas?" It might also help interest you to know that the examples we set here at American universities are also seen all over the world. Last December, in the South China Morning Post, which is kind of the New York Times of Hong Kong, Fire discovered an op-ed by a Chinese academic that cited campus censorship in the United States. He was defending a policy that banned students at Hong Kong University from debating or discussing independence from China, in response to an American professor who'd argued the opposite. The Chinese academic, and this was a little embarrassing to us, actually suggested that people visit Fire's website to read about campus censorship, saying that it's hypocritical for a professor from the United States, where disinvitations of speakers and restrictions in speech are all too common, to criticize China for similarly drawing lines around acceptable bounds of discourse. Now, on the one hand, he is making a fallacious argument. Bad behavior in the United States is no justification for worse behavior in China. On the other hand, he's not wrong about the hypocrisy, at least on a societal level. The Chinese government and many Chinese people presumably have real reason to fear the disruption and disorder that a growing and successful Hong Kong independence movement would likely bring. But if it's not acceptable for the Chinese to clamp down on these activists for their views, and I think most of us would agree that it's not, why exactly is it okay for us to do it in the United States? Is it really so comforting that in contrast to Xi Jinping, America's presumptive censor-in-chief, President Donald Trump is democratically elected? And it's not just Chinese academics who are opportunistically leveraging speech controversies in America. We discovered a few months ago that it was actually a Russian Twitter account run by a Kremlin-connected troll farm masquerading as the Tennessee Republican Party that caused Drexel professor George Teacherell-Marr's tweet satirically saying, "All I want for Christmas is white genocide," to go viral. Now, that doesn't mean that wouldn't have happened anyway, but this Russian discovery predictably resulted in widespread outrage and threats against the professor that led to him being put on leave by the university, quote unquote, for his own safety. That is, the Russians discovered he said this and people were angry that he'd said it. This ultimately led to his inability to teach his classes and, just a couple months ago, to his resignation. With such a lousy climate for free speech, especially on campus, it's no surprise that the Russian government discovered that this climate provided a shiny red button to press to inflame and annoy the United States. If we refuse to bridge the gaps, speak to one another, and we don't elevate the discourse above white genocide and online mobbing, we'll continue to be vulnerable to this kind of exploitation. Fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, Auburn's recent green light rating puts it in a great position to foster an environment that is conducive to the vibrant debate and free expression that characterizes the most rewarding college experiences. But free speech is about more than just policies. Fostering that kind of environment takes efforts from administrators, faculty, and students. It asks that each individual make the effort to support and listen to each other, even and especially when that is the most difficult. As a step toward creating this kind of environment, many schools have adopted the recent University of Chicago Statement on Principles for Free Expression. The statement reads, in relevant part, the university is committed to the principle that it may not restrict debate or deliberation because the ideas put forth are thought to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the members of the university community to make those judgments for themselves. As a corollary to this commitment, members of the university community must also act in conformity with this principle. Although faculty, students, and staff are free to criticize, contest, and condemn the views expressed on campus, they may not obstruct, disrupt, or otherwise interfere with the freedom of others to express views they reject or even loathe. To date, 34 other universities, from Princeton to the Citadel to Michigan State, have adopted the Chicago Statement. Given the promise we see here at Auburn, I hope Auburn will consider making itself number 35. Now, of course, the rubber meets the road when the ideas being expressed are considered to be, or at least to be related to, what many people consider to be the most vile ideas ever encountered. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, Auburn was visited last year by Richard Spencer, after a member of the public rented out Foy Auditorium so that he could give a speech about white nationalism. Auburn's initial reaction to this speech was laudable. It issued a statement condemning Spencer's views, but not forbidding him to speak, saying in part, Auburn supports the constitutional right to free speech. We encourage the campus community to respond to speech they find objectionable with their own views in civil discourse, and to do so with respect and inclusion. Unfortunately, under a lot of pressure, Auburn, like many universities before it, changed course and made a mistake. It declared that it would be canceling the speech because of safety concerns. I think all of us at FIRE winced when we heard that Auburn had canceled the speech. In the 1992 Supreme Court case of Forsyth County, Georgia versus the Nationalist Movement, the court made it clear that a public institution could not cancel a speech or even charge more for security or permits for a speech based on the opinions of the speaker or the chances that people opposed to the speaker would engage in violence or destruction. Burdening speakers based on the reaction of hostile listeners is called the heckler's veto, because it gives the government a veto over who may speak based on the vehemence of that person's opponents. The reason we don't allow a heckler's veto is simple. If violence or destruction, either threatened or actual, is allowed to be a reason to cancel controversial speakers, those opposed to the speaker have every reason to threaten as much violence as possible in order to silence their opponents. As surely as night follows day, Auburn was sued, and its decision to cancel the speech was quickly reversed by a federal judge who wrote in his finding that, quote, discrimination on the basis of message content cannot be tolerated under the First Amendment. Auburn ended up paying $29,000 to the legal fees of Cameron Paget, the person who booked Spencer's speech. Spencer, of course, spoke anyway. I'm sure some of you were here for that, and faced some excellent and often pointed questions from the Auburn students in the audience. It's also a credit to the student body and the Auburn community that so many people turned out to exercise their own rights by peacefully protesting Spencer's appearance, and that incidents of violence were described by the Washington Post as brief, confined, and involving a few people, a sharp contrast to, say, what had happened at Berkeley when Milo Yiannopoulos attempted to speak there just 2 months earlier, or the grotesque events of Charlottesville, Virginia, that took place later in the year. By engaging with, listening to, and peacefully protesting controversial speakers like Richard Spencer, Auburn was acting in the best tradition of how Americans can deal with the speech we hate. And when both sides are listening to one another and open to challenging their own assumptions about one another, we can go farther and accomplish even more. Like I said before, you don't have to adopt your opponent's views. I know that my own political views on most matters have not changed much despite my 14 years at FIRE, and I doubt whether it would change very much in a conversation with Richard Spencer. But you do have to be willing to sincerely listen and discuss. I know of nobody alive today who more fully embodies this spirit than a musician named Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis is a black man who has befriended dozens of members of the Ku Klux Klan. His method for doing this was simple, but hard. He would go to their rallies. A lone black man would go to a KKK rally and strike up conversations with them. We had the privilege of having him address FIRE Student Conference at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia last summer. His motivation for taking such an unusual step, he said, was this question: how can you hate me when you don't even know me? Through his efforts to make friends with figures as outlandish as the Grand Wizard of the Maryland KKK, a real friendship that involved going to his house, attending events together, you name it, Davis has convinced more than 200 Klansmen to give up their robes. Often they give them to him. You can see that's from his closet at his home. He brought the Grand Wizard's robe to the speech at our conference, and let me tell you, that is a prop you do not see at his speech every day. Hearing Davis talk made me wonder, how many Klansmen or white supremacists has Twitter shunning, Facebook blocking, government censorship, or campus shaming converted? Condemning people for their beliefs and refusing to engage them is the easier path, and it can make us feel good. I know because I do it myself sometimes. Daryl Davis has refused to take the easy way out, though, and he has 200 ex-Klansmen to show for it. Do I have that much to show for my efforts? Do you? People are not persuaded by the fact that someone more powerful has forced them to shut up. And make no mistake, if you can silence someone, you are in some way more powerful than that person, regardless of who you are. They're persuaded by persuasion, the act of sitting down with someone, of getting to understand their perspective, honestly sharing your own with them, and reserving personal judgment on the person with whom you're talking. While you may disagree with them on some or many points, we have to share this country with one another. And that means not treating everyone who disagrees with you as some kind of monster. But for this to happen, this honest and sincere sharing of views, even with those most opposed to your own, that sharing of views has to be possible. And that's something only a culture of free speech, one that lives not just in the law, but in our campuses and in the hearts of our students and the people, can accomplish. Thank you for having me.
I think we'll open open it up for questions for Mr. Shibley. One more time for Mr. Shibley, please. Oh, okay. Are there any questions?
So you guys are all for free speech now, right? All right.
So it's probably still true that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. What other restrictions would you put on speech, maybe beyond that?
Well, fire has generally adopted the Supreme Court's restrictions on speech. Among those are you can restrict true threats. That's actual meaningful threats of violence against someone. You can restrict incitement, and incitement is not just the sort of thing where you're hoping people will have a revolution, like viva la revolution. It is actually saying that you are planned to engage in some kind of violent behavior at a certain time that's likely to occur. The example, I always thought it was interesting that the case that dealt with that was where the Supreme Court decided it was not incitement when a revolutionary yelled, "We'll take the fucking street later," because he said later, and that wasn't specific, and he didn't say now, so it wasn't immediate, so it wasn't incitement. Some others are libel. If you can prove libel, obviously that's not protected. Certain kinds of commercial speech aren't protected. You can't, if you're claiming your patent medicine cures cancer, that's not protected speech. Harassment, well, there's two kinds of harassment: discriminatory harassment, which is harassment based on someone's membership in a protected category, and that can change depending, what constitutes harassment changes. It's different in employment and in education, but either way, it would keep you from getting an education or keep you from really having the work experience. There's also the kind of harassment that you're making obscene phone calls at 2 in the morning that is also not protected. Time, place, and manner restrictions, which are saying that you can't, stand out on the quad with a bullhorn at 3 in the morning. Those are all also okay. Trying to think of it left. Obscenity, which is not bad words, it is basically hardcore pornography, is not protected. It doesn't mean it's illegal, but it means it's not protected. I may have missed one or two. I think there's 8 or 9 categories of it. Oh, criminal conspiracy, that's a good one. Yeah. You're conspiring to kill somebody and that involves speech. First Amendment does not protect you.
Okay. Well, you talked about how with censorship, there's really nothing new under the sun. There's always going to be threats. Are there any current Supreme Court cases or major court cases that you're looking at in fire today, or recent cases?
Well, I think one of the most noteworthy recent Supreme Court cases is actually comes from the boring and staid area of trademark law, but it's a little more interesting than most. A band of Asian guys decided they wanted to call themselves the Slants, and they wanted to sort of reclaim that insult for them, and they applied for a trademark, and they were denied because they said that it was insulting. The reason this got so much coverage is not just because it's an interesting case, but also because it's happened around the same time people were talking about whether the Washington Redskins should have a trademark. Ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that the trademark office's practice of shooting down offensive or derogatory trademarks could not stand constitutional scrutiny. They'd been doing a very patchwork job of it already. I won't. You can look. It'll be interesting. You can look up some of the trademarks that are out there. There's a lot of interesting trademarks that had somehow gotten through when this band's did not. So that didn't help their case any. But what the Supreme Court decided was that the protection of trademark law does not constitute government benefit that makes it so it's government speech. In other words, not the government saying that they're the Slants or the Redskins, but it's they're saying it and it's protecting them. And if the government was saying it, that meant the government could say, I don't want to say that. The government doesn't have to speak anything derogatory, but if it's them, they do have to allow it. And so I think that was a really interesting. Fire has a podcast, and we had the Slants on there, and they performed. They were in our office. It was a lot of fun. So, yeah.
So I'd like to ask you more from a more of a comparative perspective. So 2 weeks ago, the Polish government has passed a law that has denied history. So it has passed a law that says that if I were to accuse a Polish Gentile from participating in the Holocaust, which happened, they have legislated this out. And I'm curious, is there a fire chapter abroad? I understand that countries are very different, but that is a very, very dangerous move because, of course, Poland is not only a member of NATO, but also a member of the European Union. And it is a fire that is spreading throughout. It's not just in Poland. So I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, America really is an outlier. We are the only country with the level of protection for free speech that we have, and that includes the government restrictions on speech like what you're describing in Poland. I think that if I remember correctly, you can't even use the phrase Polish death camps. Auschwitz, for instance, I believe is in Poland, so you wouldn't be able to call that a Polish death camp. They're saying, well, the Germans were running that, it wasn't us, it was in Poland. It's now going to be a crime to describe it as Polish. That kind of law wouldn't fly because of the First Amendment of the United States. It would be a dead letter. I don't think anybody would really even introduce it. Unfortunately, we are really the heavy outlier on that. European countries generally don't have that level of protection, and there are advocates for free speech in those countries, but they are working a lot harder than I am to defend free speech in those countries because they are starting from a sort of societal assumption in many European countries that we're going to do what's best for, we're going to decide what's best for society, and then that's going to form the basis of what our government is. Instead of liberty, it's sort of based on, in many cases, and this is me, put on my political theory hat a little bit here, but the United States is a very diverse country. It's a country that has these sort of founding ideals. I mean, liberty has always been on our coinage, right? It's something that's there. To be an American is in some way to adhere to those ideals, whereas to be a Frenchman or a Polish person is, much more of an ethnic type thing. And so we have an understanding that's much broader about it, I think, because we kind of have to. Because it's like we're one Europe all in one country. I don't think we'd be able to get along with laws that are that restrictive.
What is your opinion on, I think it was Canada that they made it where you have to call people by whatever pronoun they want you to use for them? So what is your opinion?
Yeah, I believe New York City actually may have a regulation. You have to do that in some cases. So yeah, there's a live issue right now about whether or not you can be forced to use someone's preferred pronoun. That isn't something FIRE has dealt with because we haven't had that run into, but I think I don't think that's going to fly under constitutional precedent. One of the most powerful aspects of First Amendment law has to do with coerced speech. When you can restrict speech even in ways you can't coerce it. For instance, there are certain times you can restrict a newspaper from publishing things like for national security. The traditional thing they use is like the schedule of ships departing because they were afraid the U-boats would get them. So the government can actually tell a newspaper, which it almost never can, they cannot publish that. I don't really think there's any place where the government can coerce you into saying something, and so if it were to be a point where the government's going to jail you or fine you or do something because you didn't use someone's pronoun, I can't see that surviving any kind of scrutiny.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi. So I once had an anthropology class on violence and war, and one of the first things we were asked to do in this class was to define violence. And at the time I thought this was a bit silly, but I just finished reading something the other day that said that violence could include things such as silence, as in not speaking, exclusion, and all manner of other things that are not what we typically conceive of as violence. So I just wondered, what does the law have to say about the definition of violence? What does how does the meaning of violence and how we understand it play into these discussions?
That's a great question. It's interesting because the argument that violence involves things that are other than physical violence is one that we're seeing more and more. It actually formed the basis of a lot of the justification for what happened at Berkeley. You saw the pictures of it up there. The week after, the Daily Cal, which is their paper, published 5 separate op-eds, all justifying what happened. And the general tenor of the justifications was that Milo Yiannopoulos, who was going to speak there, even though he didn't actually get to speak, so they didn't know what he was really going to say, that his speech was itself violence. It was itself a form of violence because it denied their humanity or, other ways was offensive and dehumanizing and derogatory. And that therefore, since that was a form of violence, it was appropriate to use physical violence against it. It's sort of this proportionality argument. Sort of the same argument we use about the use of weapons of mass destruction. We don't use those unless the other guys have used them first. I think it's a very dangerous idea. I mean, I think it's interesting, and I think there's something to it. It's certainly something that should be discussed, because I think particularly when it comes to psychology, when you're dealing with people who are victims of abuse and things like that, I think that a lot of times you are much more on a scale where, like in domestic abuse situations, where silence or something like that could be part and parcel of this thing. But actually to extend that in the law, and I know it has real effects on people, but to extend that into the law and say that violence is things other than actual physical violence is just, that implies, in the law that you're justified in using violence to fight back. I mean, you would effectively, it'd be Mad Max around here if that was really adopted. So I think it would be, I find it very unlikely that a court would decide that violence means something other than physical violence. Yeah.
I'd like to ask what your thoughts are on people who are involved in movements, like wide-arching movements, especially those on social media, who may advocate or commit violence, but that person individually was not involved in it.
Oh, so they're in the movement, but they don't. Well, I mean, the answer to that is, okay, the question is they're in the movement, but they don't actually participate in the violence themselves. It's actually the exact same question they were asking Paul Sweezy. There was a communist party out there that would like to overthrow the United States government. Some of them were in the United States. Obviously, some of them were outside the United States. And to be a member of that movement, that communist party, meant that you were a member of a movement that was dedicated to violent overthrow of the U.S. And that was the justification California and other places used to say, hey, you're a member of this. We don't know what you're going to do. You could be up to anything. You're effectively part of a conspiracy. You need to swear you're not part of that. I don't really think the question is any different here. I think it's brought sort of a lot closer to home by social media. I could give an entire speech on the sort of distorting effects of social media that are out there. But I think it's, if anything, made it even harder to tell, because the barriers to entry in social media are so low compared to even like being a member of the Communist Party back then. I mean, they had membership cards, that sort of thing. You'd have to like write in and go to the socialist bookstore and that sort of thing. That was part of being, now, you can adhere to ISIS by just like tweeting, yay ISIS or whatever, and they'll claim you for it. So I think we need to, I think the principle is the same, but I admit that it's a scarier world in some ways.
We have time for one more question.
I got like 2 questions really. So number one would be, so if there's for example, let's say the KKK, right? Or let's say, Black Panthers or whoever's using violence or whatever. Do you think their rights should be protected? Their free speech should be protected? And then also, if Xi Jinping was to call you and say, hey, we're thinking about getting free speech, why should we get it? What would you say to him?
Well, for the first one, yeah, obviously their rights should be protected. Just because you are maybe you are, like criminals have free speech too. Like even if you are an actual convicted criminal or whatever, now if you're in jail, there are things you can't do. You can't curse out the warden or something like you might be able to curse out a police officer if you're free. But, let's say you're a convicted criminal, you're out. Doesn't affect your First Amendment rights. So I'd say, yeah, certainly they have the right to do that as long as they're not engaging in threats or incitement, and once they do, then it's passed into the unprotected speech and the crime area, and one would hope that the law enforcement would take care of the problem. If the Klan is threatening you, that's why we have the police. As for why, if Xi Jinping called me and asked why we should have free speech, I think probably the easiest thing I would tell him is the results have spoken for themselves. The history of the United States is one of sort of increasing freedoms and increasing understanding of free speech, increasing, I think, technological and in many ways cultural progress. And we've managed to make a diverse society work, and I mean diverse in a lot of different ways. I think better and longer than anybody else has using these principles, and I think it's in large part because of these principles. One of the most frustrating things is to be told that you aren't worth listening to. And this is the one country where everybody at least can pretend, that they can go out in the street corner and they can say it and nobody's going to arrest them. That can't happen anywhere else. And I think that really is in many ways kind of a safety valve, because even the people who are the lowest of the low, even you think about the people who were African Americans who were, actually like legally discriminated against in the South, even they were able to appeal to the principles of the First Amendment. Martin Luther King talked about it in his last speech. He talked about somewhere I learned about the First Amendment, and he was right. He had to fight harder and longer than a white person would have in the same situation, but ultimately they didn't have much of a choice. Like they caught him out. He caught them and he forced them to listen, and I think that's been such a valuable thing for our society. I think China, maybe they don't have the same level of problems. They certainly don't have the same level of diversity percentage-wise that we do. But I think results have spoken for themselves. I don't think anything I do would convince the Chinese government to give up, though, because it's probably pretty awesome to be the dictator of 1 billion people.
Mr. Shibley, thank you for discussing with us what the freedom of the First Amendment affords each of us as individuals, the impact it has for our campus, and the important opportunity it provides us to be able to engage in exchanges with folks with whom we may be ideologically opposed, but for whom conversation and communication around those things can be valuable, certainly within the academy. You all join me in thanking Mr. Shibley. And please remember to join us for coffee and snacks in the atrium. We have a context for you all to be able to engage for those who would like to do that. Thank you for joining us.